Hello and welcome to this third session, exploring this topic of globalization and civil society from the perspective of not just the United Nations, but really from the perspective of civil society and global civil society in particular. So the topic of the lecture today will go into 4 parts. For those of you who have access to the long version of this lecture, you will be able to see the PowerPoint with numerous other links and illustration that will be helpful to you to understand this complex and the multifaceted elements. But in this PowerPoint, we will look at some notions of civil society that probably many of you are already familiar with. Others that had to do with NGOs, and particularly with this new development of the so-called fourth sector. The social movement organizations, which are the roots of this organizational development, if you will. And we will explore briefly the field of social network analysis and how that interrelates, particularly with some cases that I have done myself in social network in relation to Chiapas and indigenous organizations there. So we all know about civil society, but everyone means something probably different, especially if you start going global. Civil society across different countries and cultures and nations means something quite different. The notion that we have of civil society here in the United States and in large part also in the other Western democratic society in Europe is something that is not totally reflected or certainly interpreted quite differently in other countries, particularly in the Global South. The Department of Public Information of the United Nations, usually they held this annual conference and they put together numerous reflections regarding topics relevant to NGOs and civil society in general. What do they mean by civil society is more than just NGOs. Of course, NGOs, as you remember, we talked about it from the United Nations standpoint, are the privileged group because they are non-governmental. As UN is an intergovernmental organization, obviously they want to distinguish that. But in general, what is understood as a civil society worldwide is civil society organization, or CSOs, community-based organization, or CBOs, non-governmental organization, NGOs, but also things like social movement, labor unions, faith-based organization, FBOs sometimes, foundations, and many, many others that sometimes falls into those categories or different intersecting categories. Civil societies have grown quite rapidly in the last decades, both in size, number, but also scope and capacity. In the ability to have those important all elements and topics and values that sometimes civil society portrayed through also the use of media, but also the use of other channels of communication and expressions that are usually more favorable in democratic society, that allow those kind of expressions. The economic integration is also an important factor. That's why we study this from a globalization standpoint, which some people would argue is just more globalism, this economic or sometimes free kind of trade type of environment in which civil society are part of the instrument to promote this, but also to oppose the same phenomenon, right? Because we see that sometimes undermines importance, human, social, cultural, and other values that those integrations somehow threaten. In general, another view of global civil society expansion and civil society organization expansion is also highlighted by the Yearbook of International Organization. If you're not familiar with that, probably you want to look into it because it's a nice overview and usually is something also approved or in line with the other statistics that with UN DESA and UN ECOSOC, that in which they also provide the forums of these other various civil society organizations. Also, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD countries, they report the role and the type of partnerships that they promote with civil society organizations. And they estimate that approximately 15 billion in international assistance also is channeled through CSO's participation. That's very important, particularly in the European context, in which most of the development work is done through the participation of NGOs. Here in the United States as well, but sometimes it's less visible, or sometimes it's channeled by specialized groups and agencies. Or the evidence of private philanthropic money, for instance, in this country is much more evident and vivid than in other countries in which the government type of assistance are the default choice. As we mentioned in lecture 2, if you remember, the United Nations, since its inception, understood the fundamental importance of having the non-governmental organization and civil society an active participant in the accomplishment of its mission, particularly from the development and assistance side, but certainly many other areas that in the last few decades we have seen that civil society could play a vital role also in terms of security, peace building, and other areas. Some interesting manifestation of global civil society are happening within organizations like the World Social Forum. As you can recognize, if you're not familiar with that, is almost in antithesis with the Economic Social Forum, the World Economic Forum, that usually is the so-called Davos meeting every year, which is kind of an elite group, but they somehow try to make some important reflection and trends from an economic and also security and development standpoint. The World Social Forum is this grassroots, is this kind of bottom-up type of entity of different organizations, different constituencies worldwide. It started for a few years in Porto Alegre, Brazil, and then has expanded into other countries. This year just was concluded, was in Tunisia. Interesting enough, in relation to this reflection about the role of civil society in relation to government or non-government, I remember the position of the World Social Forum in relation to the participation of former Brazilian President Ignacio Lula da Silva. If you know a little bit the history of Brazil, this president was really the result of a strong grassroots campaign, actually for many years, that he tried to gain the leadership, the political leadership of this country, based on the fact that numerous people were victims of huge inequalities, huge situation of corruption, and him as a labor union organizer, he was brought up really by this large movement under the umbrella of the Labour Party, but certainly with a much larger coalition of groups, church organizations, and others that were supporting this, with the idea of promoting more social justice, more integration, and so forth. Well, he succeeded. And when he tried to go to this large forum, which also was generated in Brazil, but practically the same movement, if you know about the landless movement, or Movimento do Sem Terra, is one of those organizations quite active in Brazil to claim land rights, and they had also quite active / controversial ways of exemplifying those rights by occupying land that were usually taken by large landowners. So when Ignacio Lula da Silva attempted to go back there, the leadership of this movement, they said no, because now you're government. Now you're a government representative, so you're on the other side. And it's, as you can see from the background of this photo, that's not always the case. As you can see, some other government officials have participated more recently to those forums. And it's interesting because this kind of controversial view of being within or without the government, distinguished by this, is somehow a blurred identity also of what we mean by civil society.
The Italians take this concept and set up a separate social forum when G8 was in Genoa. Is that...
Yes. Well, you mentioned one expression of civil society participation that pertains to the so-called anti-globalization movement. The so-called anti-globalization movement that sometimes has been described really about a different globalization, because it's really not against globalization, but it's against that kind of abuse or claim that globalization has to happen only in one way, particularly from an economic free enterprises, and less access to certain social justice. So when during the G8 that you mentioned in Genoa was one of these expressions of different movement that created a coalition, in this case for resistance. Obviously the G8 represented the great powers and therefore represented this so-called global movement. What is interesting is that within that expression, even though they had some violent episode from the anarchist group, etc., what is interesting is really this grassroots participation. That's what's important. So there is a lot of participation from small groups, more coalition. They sometimes are religious based, sometimes are from different type of ideologies and values, from human rights to others, that they kind of take together. And another example was really the different protests against war and therefore promoting peace. That's another example of it. Manuel Castel is one of those authors quite well known in the globalization study field that has written an interesting study about the network society, how the society is really about this network. And he has this book about the description of these various movements and identity that some of them characterize and express these dimensions of globalization, from women's movement to labor movement to actually even resistance movement like the one I'm going to show you, which is the Zapatista movement. Another interesting expression is from the Action Against Poverty, which is also behind the Millennium Development Goals, so the anti-poverty campaign, for 2015, for making poverty history, kind of campaign. These white bands you might have seen people wear in the United States has been co-opted or centralized mostly by the One campaign, but really in other countries, particularly in the UK, is the Make Poverty History campaign. And there are other type of organizations that really try to advocate and make a coalition like the Call to Action Against Poverty, CCAP, that attempt to make this coalition of different groups and organizations of civil society. You might have seen the campaign Stand Up Against Poverty, something like that. But beside this, what do we really mean by civil society? This is still a matter of concern and speculation among scholars, right? Even in this program, if you have participated to some of the conferences from the Arnova to iStar, etc., there are numerous instances of organizations and scholars that reflect on it. The London School of Economics Center for Civil Society, that you are reading one of their publications on the Global Civil Society yearbook, refer to this kind of concept in three elements. One is that civil society referred to the arena of uncoerced collective action. So there is this dimension of kind of freedom of expression, freedom of participation, around shared interests purposes, and values. Number two, in theory, its institutional forms are distinct from those of the state, the family, and the market. Though in practice, the boundaries between state, civil society, family, and market are often complex, blurred, and negotiated. You see that there is this kind of distinction in practice. In theory and practice. In number three, the civil society commonly embraces a diversity of spaces, actors, and institutional forms, varying in their degree of formality, autonomy, and power. So again, this other dimension that has to do with the diversity of it. So other organizations attempt to define civil society, like the World Bank as an important definition and contribution that obviously is closely related to non-governmental organization. They said the term civil society to refer to the wide array of non-governmental and non-for-profit organizations that have a presence in public life, expressing the interests and values of their members or others, based on ethical, cultural, political, scientific, religious, or philanthropic considerations. Civil society organizations, or CSOs, therefore refer to a wide array of organizations, community groups, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, labor unions, indigenous groups, charitable organizations, faith-based organizations, professional associations, and foundations. So you see that now under this umbrella, according to them, of CSOs, now they include, World Bank like to include any other ones, including NGOs and so forth. Another interesting definition, or at least to attempt to differentiate, comes from the Inter-American Development Bank. Obviously, their purpose is different. It's not really about defining, but really about establishing the right partnerships for accomplishing their own mandate for development, in particular, obviously, in Latin America. So civil society organizations that they include in their kind of partnership and coalition, they are recognized as feasible partners are, in general, non-governmental organizations, community organizations, community groups, and groups of residents directly affected by a bank finance project, non-profit organizations, business associations, universities, academia, research center, and professional associations whose fields of study make significant contribution to the IDB, religious institutions, group of indigenous and Afro-descendant people, and other groups of particular interest to our institution. So again, you see, it's still kind of the morphosis of this definition that tries to attempt to define more type of classification, more type of organizational identity, with the purpose of establishing a larger platform for collaborations and partnerships. This is some kind of example, sample of the main institutional representative of civil society. Academia, activist groups, charities, citizen militia, civic groups, clubs, community foundation, community organization, consumer organization, cooperatives, churches, cultural groups, environmental groups, foundations, intermediate organization for the voluntary and non-profit sectors, men's group, non-governmental organization, non-profit organizations, policy institution, political parties, private voluntary organization, professional associations, religious organization, social enterprises, support groups, trade unions, voluntary associations, and women's group. Again, this is just a very small sample of what could be a very complex plethora of civil society organizations that becomes even more complex when you go across countries, across different legal systems that recognize those in a variety of ways. Just to mention a few scholars, one is Robert Putnam that you're familiar with. With this argument, if you remember from your readings of Bowling Alone, the classic reading that he has done on the analysis of American, kind of social capital, he argued that even non-political organizations in civil society are vital for democracy. This is because they build social capital, trust, and shared values, which are transferred into the political spheres and help to hold society together, facilitating an understanding of the interconnectedness of society and interests within it. So this, which is obviously important for us because of our dimension and interest in terms of public service, in the interconnection between, government type of, funding and government type of provision of other both services and other entities, as well as the collaboration with non-profits and non-governmental organizations. That's certainly interesting. But at the international level, what this means is that the responsibility of both funding agencies as well as partnering agency for delivering this regards the provision of or promotion of more democratic society. Again, another ambiguous term that we know that sometimes has a double-edged sword, right? But again, if we identify democracy as not just simply governance that reflects more democratic type of governance, if we associate that with the system of rule of law, if we associate that with the system also of democratic expression, which is not just about voting, but really active participation of expression of various level and dimensions of life, you understand that civil society is essential for the promotion and the realization, let's say, of democracy, which is still kind of this large concept. Obviously, no one has the legitimacy to claim that really we are democratic, right? I mean, we're far away from the real practical accomplishment from it. And yet, civil society is an essential instrument, is an essential ingredient. So, global civil society. When we talk about global civil society, which is even more recent phenomena and more recent reflections, started about 15 years ago, reflecting about this phenomenon. Civil society, you could trace this the definition even in modern history, but you can even go back to Plato and Aristotle, certainly in their understanding of civil society. But the gradual worldwide emergence of the rule of law and the networks of relationship among people in a world composed of both state and non-state actors. What does this mean in the complex situation? Well, let's start from the UN concept. If you recall, I mentioned this before, probably on session 1, how the United Nations, recognize this distinction between regime and government with the rest. The bottom you see here is kind of the civil society is profit-seeking and non-profit seeking. And that's why it's interesting today in this distinction of the public and the private sectors, but also in this other variation or blurred type of identities that pertains to social enterprises. So this one becomes even more complex, civil society, when you look at things like social obligations, political systems and regime, public institutions, and sustainable livelihood and markets. Obviously, the economic, the government, the political, and the familiar boundaries are those dimensions or trends or direction that better help us to define this complexity of the phenomenon. There are numerous more that I invite you to look in the larger PowerPoint that I described. Let me go over and get to another issue which is not as easily defined, or at least as confused probably as civil society, which is still pertain to NGO. Even NGOs is an attempt to kind of clarify the organizational configuration, particularly for their relation at the international level. NGOs in international politics is something that has certainly found more relevance after World War II, with certainly the beginning of the UN Charter. Article 71 specifies that with this text. The Economic and Social Council, so this is about the so-called ECOSOC, may make suitable arrangements for consultation with non-governmental organizations which are concerned with matters within its competency. Such arrangements may be made with international organizations and, where appropriate, with national organizations after consultation with the members of the United Nations concerned. And you can see more that from this definition of the Article 71, there has been more elaborations within that. By the end of the year 1914, there was 1,083 NGO in existence. International NGOs played a vital role in anti-slavery movement. So even before the UN, certainly even the movement for women's suffrage. The official definition of international NGO was defined on February 27, 1950, by Resolution 288 of the ECOSOC. So I put you a link here for you to explore more. This is kind of one of the recent commemoration for the end of slavery, which was held at the General Assembly in New York. Again, just to see that there are deeper roots than just simply the definitions of the UN Charter. Something interesting for you that it's not necessarily relevant only from a legal standpoint, but really to understand the classification and therefore the eligibility of NGOs to enter with ECOSOC and the United Nations is an element, is an instrument for you to better understand what these NGOs are. So within the various specifications, there are three main elements that are required within that. There has to be some international standing, which means also they are in existence, some kind of legal configuration from their legitimate government authorities. Independent governance, because as you know, here we enter into this kind of blurred boundaries, because there are numerous instances in many countries that NGOs are practically created by the government. And they're just simply, an instrument for government to do things. You'll see actually from the video from the DPI video that I suggested you to look at it, you'll see many examples there. The other one is the geographical affiliation. Now, usually, there has to be some kind of relevance in the territory that also goes in line with some of the mission and specification of ECOSOC. In the case of international entity, which was the main target of ECOSOC, you were supposed to provide proof that you're working on 3 or more countries. Now, the expansion of these kind of partnerships have been happening with DESA. DESA is the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, which they're kind of including not just, they're including all civil society organizations, not just non-governmental organizations, but also institutions, foundation, association, etc. And that's something interesting that is also visible within the DPI as well. So it's not just the traditional INGOs, the international non-governmental organization, who obviously have a mandate, have a mission quite close or closely connected to one or more of the areas of the United Nations. So, what is really an NGO? A non-governmental organization, NGO, is generally considered to be any non-state, non-profit, voluntary organization at three levels. One, as a non-state entity, an NGO is generally independent from government influence. Again, the independence is kind of defined in the large documents, but sometimes it's quite difficult to determine. Is not a part of a control by government or intergovernmental agency. As such, an NGO is either non-established by a government or intergovernmental agreement, or if established in such manner, is now independent of such influence. Number two, as a non-profit organization, NGO is not operated for the primary purpose of carrying on a trade or business, although profits may be generated for the mission of the organization. So non-profit, as you know from your study, is not that you don't make any profit. It's how those profits are obviously redistributed. As a voluntary organization, an NGO is not required to exist by law, but is formed by private initiatives resulting from voluntary action of individuals. And I put here a link of the NGO handbook because it gives some other insights, both in the definition as well as the typologies. Just a little sample of the complex world of acronyms existing at the UN in relation to NGOs. You might be familiar with some of those. Bingo is not the one that you play in a Catholic church. It's actually big international NGOs. CSO, Civil Society Organization. DONGO, Donor Organized NGOs. ENGO, Environmental NGO. GONGO, Government Operated NGOs. INGO, International NGOs, QUANGO, Quasi-Autonomous NGOs, TANGO, Technical Assistance NGOs, GSO, Grassroots Support Organization, and MANGO, Market Advocacy Organization. But there are many more. You know, there is probably a long list I've seen of probably 100 plus type of acronym in relation to NGOs and CSOs. Again, this is one way to define the complexity of it. Probably some of you have read about Alan Fowler's argument about the fourth position of the NGOs, right? The NGO is really not something that is kind of in between. In this case, civil society and this kind of more familiar, level, or grassroots level, the government sector or public sector, and then the private sector. So now the NGOs are playing this vital fourth role position. But they also have different roles as NGOs, as professional NGOs, particularly in other areas, as this illustration shows, in terms of mediation, consultation, and social welfare. And again, if you look at the long slideshow, you'll see many other examples of this. You probably have heard this about the fourth sectors, the emergence of the fourth sector. I put here a link for you to be familiar with if you haven't heard of it. But there is more and more reflections about this, how the emergence of this fourth sector. So something that is, again, another example of blurring boundaries between these three things. Particularly, the fourth sectors is defined between the government, business, and nonprofit, the so-called three sectors that you have studied. With things that, think about cooperatives. Cooperatives are really about in between, something that is legitimized by kind of shared governance. It's not a private entity, and a nonprofit. Or nonprofit-owned companies, or emerging hybrids like social enterprises, obviously, are example of it. L3C and other configuration in the law, even in these countries, are just one example of the many other instances and examples of it. So we defined a little bit what civil societies are. We talked briefly how NGOs are relevant within the UN, and particularly in relation with the fourth sector. Now, what is the relation with the social movement? This is something that is a matter of concern, particularly for social scientists and sociologists in particular that have studied movement, grassroots movement and social movement for social change or other things like this. One of the famous case, sort of the American civil rights movement, that you are familiar with, which has been a matter of study, of what does this come from? What are the dynamics and the theories that helps us to understand not just this movement, other movements worldwide. We just ended the conference in, there was just a conference this past weekend in Indiana University, reflecting about this so-called spring, Arab awakening or Arab Spring, whatever it's called, reflecting where did this come from. And obviously, many of these instances, even though they were described under this general umbrella, they were quite different from one another, right? So in terms of social change, there are attempts for classifying this movement according to that, into how much change and who is changed. Sometimes those changes or the purpose of these movements are more specific and their amount of change is more limited, or you get to a more radical change and affecting everyone, that you get to a more revolutionary social movement. The alternative social movement theory, which Melucci was one of the authors that has started this field, really speaks about this specialized movement that do not attempt to have like a political change itself, but they talk about some specific areas of concern. Also, in the similar way that you have studied probably on organizational evolution, right, from Max Weber to others, you will see that the stages of a social movement are quite similar, from an emergence to a coalition, like this kind of coalition and creation of a more identifiable unity, to a level of bureaucratization that will lead to other elements. There could be a success or a failure, a co-optation, particularly from government administration or other economic forces, repression, or go mainstream. So you see that becomes, and then always a decline. And then within that, you may have a different cycles, different specialized movement or different subjects. So I'm not going to go over these theories with you because I don't want to bore you to death. But the long PowerPoint includes a description of each one of these theories. Collective behavior theories, grievance, Marxist theories and cycle of protest, resource mobilization theory, political process model, new social movement theories, collective identity, and cycle of protest are just a sample of the many theories that attempt to explain how social movements emerge. Again, we're looking at social movement for the simple reason is that, as you have seen from the previous slides, there is always something before the formation of an organization. So the organization, even though you can also create and fund based on whatever, but usually when they are expression of the movement, when they're expression of something that is not just the individual founder with the idea, but really when it comes from a grassroots, is something that is more meaningful to understand in these cycles. So the last part I want to talk about is really about network analysis, because when you enter in this complexity of organizational structure, then you require different tools to understand them. And the tools that are now are very helpful is network analysis. You might be familiar with network analysis for, even in computer science, they're using that, especially social networks now, they're studying those things, or other, how your website, I've seen Google Analytics and stuff like this. But really, the science has started even earlier, for the study even of organizations. Let's say, even in this department, like you would know what an organizational chart is, so you know who is in charge, and then the other one with different configuration. The faculty, so you know the director, the faculty, then you have the staff, you have the part-time lecturer, then you have other constituencies. It could be you as a student, but you have also the alumni, you have other kind of stakeholder, etc. Right? But then if you really want to understand how the communication works in an organization like ours, in the School of Public Service, you need to understand that certain people have more information, even though they might be lower in the organizational chart. They might be more key for implementing changes than others, right? So that's what network analysis does. So understand that those dynamics, even in the workplace, are different than what just simply the structural configuration of the organization is. So that's an example of in the study of negotiation for pro-union, anti-union owners and bargaining units. This one is an example of OECD trade flow. So you understand even the size, not just the direction, but also the size of this kind of line represents the frequency of it. There are others, probably charts you have seen about Facebook. The analysis of Facebook, how much frequency there is worldwide, etc. This one is an organizational chart shows how authority ties would look. So Manuel, Charles, Donna, Stewart, right? That's the kind of example I gave you before about the organizational chart, right? Simple thing, individual unit, within the departments, etc. But that's how it really works. The advice seeking. So you see that, Donna or Charles, sometimes have more relevance or, kind of authority in a way than others. Or can be restructured to reveal the real hierarchy. Those are interesting, type of things. And so there are also softwares that allow you to do that. It's like you're familiar with SPSS, or you might know NVivo for qualitative. Qualitative is an NVivo. NVivo is a qualitative software for analyzing interviews and kind of in-depth or lengthy qualitative analysis. SPSS is for quantitative analysis. So there are numerous other tools that are used for this kind of network. So you're now exposed, or at least mentioned to you to these techniques of network analysis. You will be doing some of that, not at this complexity, but some of it. You will read this from one of your articles about the networks type. One of the articles that are also in your D2L site are part of the study of the global civil society. Another volume from the one that you have, they talk about these network types. This is the cliché network, the circle network, and the star network. Those are the three main typology of networks. This is an example how this typology would work in a study that Olsen has done on international Zapatismo. So it's the same study I've done with this group society of the Zapatismo movement. Is not just a civil society. There is also an army group, like an armed group. There is also an international group. So the study of Olsen is about the international aspect of it and how these relate with different entities. He also, this is from his own study, the informational infrastructure of the Zapatista network, from the indigenous level, you see here, the national level, the international level, and the global level. And some of these level are usually exemplified not only by chapters and groups, let's say in Spain or Italy, but also a global level because of the symbology of it. Let's say Subcomandante Marcos became a symbol at a certain point of anybody who was struggling about their own justice and rights. So including people with different sexual orientation would be claiming that, Marco is that. So it was a symbol of it. So let me give you just a few insights. Actually, this is based also on my own research of this. In terms of a social movement, there are numerous theories that apply to it. Certainly grievance, the fact that many of these indigenous people were marginalized for centuries. within that. This photo, by the way, is a symbolic representation when the indigenous people went to this town called San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas, and they tore down the statue of the Spanish conqueror that was there in the middle of the town. So it was kind of symbolic. Resource mobilization, political opportunity, cross-border network, framework analysis, and collective identity and action are some of the relevant theory to understand this movement. The Zapatista net war is actually something that has been applied. The net war theory and type of analysis is something that have been exemplified in numerous military studies of resistance. It actually started in Vietnam and now have expanded into other modern identity of using of internet, for instance, and other type of communication, modern communications for understanding this thing. The RAND Corporation, that you might be familiar with, have done an interesting study also for this movement regarding that. Because obviously the military, in this case the Mexican army, they were interested to, well, contain, let's say, the problem, but they were internally they were perceived as those who were oppressing and further not allowing them to express their own identity. So the Zapatista movement could be exemplified. This EZLN stands for Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional. So this is the army. But even the army itself has a leadership part and the autonomous based community. Actually, more recently, they have developed some kind of civil society groups within this hierarchy that they're still part of the Zapatistas per se, but they're kind of civilians. They're protected by people with weapons, but they're civilian. The civil society, in particular, there is more organizations that are indigenous, Mexican civil society, labor union, etc. They were sympathizing with that. And then at the international level, various human rights pacifist groups, etc. They were, sympathizing with this. The analysis of a human rights network is quite interesting because as in the early time of this rebellious time, the civil society organizations, which were indigenous organizations, at the time of when they were receiving some kind of human rights violation, they would go to the local human rights center, and the human rights center would send the messages at the international level. They would do their claim with the channels of the government, but they also send, with other organizations, right? Non-governmental like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, right? Or governmental, they will do their petition with the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, the National Commission for Human Rights, etc. Then later on, the civil society got, empowered and with the capacity of doing this themselves. So they were able to do it, and still nowadays, I still receive a lot of communiques and a lot of actions that they do it themselves, while before was kind of mediated by others. It's kind of interesting doing that. That's another example of how, in this case, international human rights observers who were from different countries were there to witness certain human rights violation, while before the classic channel is from national NGOs to go to the government. The government have this mechanism of buffering, so they would not do much. So by utilizing international and foreign observers, they would certainly claim something for the foreign or international NGOs. Go to their own correspondent government, let's say Sweden, right? So they were observer in Mexico from the government of Sweden. The government of Sweden, through others, like say the European Union or others, with pressure economically and politically, in this case the Mexican government, to comply with more human rights respect and respect for human rights there. You understand? So this is kind of an interesting study of network that it's also functional for that. So in conclusion, this is just a little list of resources. I have included much more, many more, in the other PowerPoints. So I invite you to have a look at them to see and to familiarize with the many complex definitions and examples of global civil society and civil society in general. So keep in mind that, again, within the study of civil society, you need to understand particularly the function of NGO, non-governmental organization, even though in this country, United States, we tend to focus more on the non-profit side. The non-governmental side is also important. It's important because in many countries, those functions are completely different. So even in this country, actually, but they're less evident. So the NGOs are those who cooperate mostly at the international level, while the non-profit, they take a function that is more local. But these things are changing quite rapidly. So you find more and more local non-for-profit that are expanding their operations and mission worldwide. So I hope you enjoyed this and that has been useful to you.